note in the chat. It's Thursday. We've gotten over hump day. So we're getting ready to end the week with a bang. And it's a great conversation to be having as we wrap up this week, because today we're talking all about data. And interestingly enough, there was a point in time, like I suppose everything else with tech, where data and analytics seemed like something that was for somebody else to be talking about, right? Or something that resided in the IT department. And this is one of the ways that digital transformation is actually impacting our day-to-day, our everyday, because no longer are we in a situation where, well, we only talk about certain things, you know, with the IT guys, or if we have a problem with our computer at work, etc. We are now impacted in a way where data, we talk about customer interactions and customer journeys, different technology tools, all of these things, strategy, you know, thinking about all of these different things related to digital transformation are like a part of our lives now. And whether we want to admit it or not, we are actually actively in our own way experiencing digital transformation on an ongoing basis. And data is another aspect of how that happens. All right. So today we're going to be taking some time to actually look at the principles of data and to get a better understanding and appreciation, I hope, for the role that data plays in our everyday lives, and also in how digital transformation is affecting our businesses. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. While I'm doing that, you guys can follow Catherine. Catherine has dropped a note to talk about how her week has been going. Busy like myself. Catherine, my week has also been busy. So I totally get it. And I'm looking forward to having a nice weekend wind down. You know, just looking forward to it being a nice weekend experience. Oh, today's Independence Day for Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, well, happy independence. That's so exciting. Wonderful. Jamaica just recently, at the beginning of the month, we had all our independence celebrations. So happy Independence Day to TNT, Trinidad and Tobago. Excellent. Is today a public holiday in Trinidad also? I'm very curious about that. I think that's very cool. Oh, it is. Okay. It is a holiday. Okay, great. I understand that. Makes sense to me now. So for those persons who couldn't attend today, we know where they are. They're out there doing all the independent celebrations. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we're talking about data analytics. And before we jump in, we want to make sure that we are recalling our ground rules. Participation is key. What you get in, what you put in, you get out. And actually, you know, this is really informational and inspirational, and, you know, providing learning and growth opportunities, because I learned something new today based on your participation. So thank you very much for that. So sometimes you'll be actually participating and, you know, it's somebody else that gets the aha. So we just encourage you to participate as we go through our session today. We can disagree, but of course we provide feedback as long as we do so constructively and respectfully. And we'll put on our deep listening ears, right? We talked about that. This is the place to make mistakes, to learn, and to grow together, including me, your facilitator. And we're each responsible for our own behavior while we are here. So I'm Stacey Hines, and I will be taking you through our agenda today, which is focused on a few aspects concerning data. Right? So we will look at the different ways that businesses can collect data ethically, because this is something that's a really hot topic now in many organizations. It's data collection with the dawn of GDPR and all these new data privacy and protection laws. you can understand why we need to do it now end to end. We have to talk about collecting the data at the beginning and doing so ethically, so that by the time we start talking about protection and any fines, etc., you would have already been doing what you're supposed to be doing to make sure you're on the right track. We're also going to touch on analyzing data so that you can use it in your decision making. And if you recall, in our strategy session, there was also a conversation about data-driven decision making, because a key part of executing your digital strategy is going to be using data to support you in knowing when you're on track towards success or off track away from what you're ultimately trying to create. And also, it helps you to recognize when you are successful. How do you know that you've hit your targets? How do you know that you're satisfying your market or your customer? That's through the use of data. And so today we're going to expand on that just a little bit more, to talk about how data-driven decision-making is impacting organizations as they embrace digital transformation. So some of the objectives that we're going to be tackling is we're going to talk about the principles of data ethics and some of the collection methods that are being used. We'll also get into the details around data analytics and talk about how it can actually help our MSMEs in their businesses on a day-to-day basis. And then we'll finish off with understanding the importance of data privacy and protection. Now, you would have received a case study in our last session. And while it was a strategy session, ladies and gentlemen, it was specifically related to data. It was a data-related strategy session. And it was specifically focused on a fast fashion growth retailer that has over 600 stores, which is quite significant, right? And they decided that they were going to modernize their store designs to give customers new and inspiring experiences. And they determined that they wanted to really understand whether or not they were hitting the mark. And they used data to actually help them with understanding that. And the way that they did this was through partnering with a company called Verint, and utilizing their experience management technology to measure store digital fulfillment and the different types of experiences that their customers were having. And so for this particular test that they were doing, it was related to buying online and going into the store to pick up, which for now, if you recall, during COVID, you couldn't go anywhere, right? So in this particular instance, they were able to actually deploy something that created a hybrid kind of experience. And those are always ones that you want to kind of gauge to see whether or not it's actually hitting the mark. So their buy online, pick up in store fulfillment model is something that they wanted to test to see how successful it was, what kind of customer information they were getting, and they were utilizing different ways to collect that customer information in different types of data to actually be able to analyze and see. Now, I don't know if anybody had a chance to actually read the case study, but I thought it was really well aligned in that it was coming from the strategy class, but at the same time, a strategy session, but at the same time, it directly led into the conversation that we had today. So I'm just going to ask for those of you that are a part of the session today, if any of you had an opportunity to actually read the case study, what were your primary takeaways? Did any of you have a chance to read the case study? I would love it if you could share even one takeaway that you got from reading it. All right. So just a couple of the things that stood out for me as a part of the case study was the different ways that they collected the data. So they didn't just try one method. It's not like they just decided that they were going to do surveys, right? They did multiple types of data collection. And this, I think, is a really great way for us to think about our customers and how we engage them at different stages during the journey, because not every customer engages in the same way, as we've discussed in prior sessions. And so I like the way that they actually thought through, listening to the customer's voice through different mediums. So they use both digital channels and they also use non-digital channels, right? They did different types of posts on social media. And, they also used things like, surveys and telephone calls to gather this data. Clearly, if they're utilizing telephone calls, that's more conversational, a bit less structured in how the information is being collected, but one way or another, they were able to actually connect with their customers utilizing different approaches. I also appreciated that Route 21 didn't think about just doing this on their own. I think one of the things that they did very effectively was they partnered with a company that this is their area of expertise or their zone of genius. And the truth is that as you go through the content for today, you're going to see that there's a lot of technicality behind the data analytics or data science space. And it's less about becoming an expert for yourself and really more about, what can I learn or grasp or understand that I can use in my conversations with MSMEs as I provide them with guidance towards basic data practices, and also when they're thinking about engaging with a data expert company, data science expert or data science expertise from a company to utilize in their own businesses, right? And when you look at the results that were a part of the actual engagement that they went into with Variant, you'll see the thing that I think stood out to me the most was the amount of increase in orders that they received month over month, because they were now implementing the changes that came from the customer interactions. So what you'll see, guys, is that it's one thing to collect the data, but if you're not doing anything with the data, then you're literally wasting your time. And what we found, both myself as an independent contractor and also just in working with data science companies and data science entrepreneurs, is that a lot of companies, especially our MSMEs, they will try the data collection, but they don't necessarily want to have a clear strategy for how it is going to be utilized, how it's going to benefit them. And even if they have an idea, they're not necessarily equipped to implement the strategy. And so it's one thing to collect it, but you have to be clear on how that data collection is going to be leveraged, how it's going to benefit, and how it is going to actually support the organization in achieving its targets. So let's talk about ethical data collection, because that is also one of the key things that will come from getting support. You want to make sure getting support, whether it is that you're going out and studying, researching, etc., or hiring in a company the way Route 21 did. You want to make sure that the data that is being collected is obtained ethically and legally, because persons now are sharing their information online so freely. For many persons, we really have to make sure that we are considering the moral obligations that we have for gathering, protecting, and utilizing personally identifiable information, also known as PII, and how it affects individuals. Everyone within an organization really needs to understand this, right? Whether or not they're going to be experts, it's something that we need to make sure that we are understanding, regardless of the role, because we are all in some way, shape, or form interacting with data. right? Once a business is operating, we are interacting with the data. And so we want to understand that this data that we're interacting with is being collected in an ethical way. Now, when we think about ethical data collection, there are 5 different things that we want to factor in, right? We want to factor in ownership, okay? And when we think about ownership, what we're actually considering is the fact that, technically speaking, we do not actually own anyone's data but our own, right? Any personal information about a person belongs to them. That means an organization must obtain consent to collect that information, because ultimately it doesn't belong to them directly, right? So it could be assigning a written agreement, online T&C, which you all would probably be familiar with, because you would have at some point in time, if you're purchasing or doing business online, which I think everyone in here has said they do, you're going to check a box that says, I'm in agreement to the terms and conditions, or I'm in agreement to the privacy policy of this organization. And sometimes we don't even read it because you've now become so accustomed to seeing these check boxes at the end of all our different statements. I will, however, encourage you, especially if you're not familiar with the company that you are purchasing from, I highly recommend that you take a glance over the terms and conditions or the data protection policies, and take a gander at it, which sometimes can feel like a bother for people because it's so much information. But this ownership piece is very much related to that. Next, we want to talk a little bit about transparency. And when you think about transparency, simply asking for consent to collect customer personal information is not enough. You also, as organizations, should be prepared to tell consumers what information is being collected, how the information is going to be used, and where the information is going to be stored. So you may not necessarily say so in your way of collecting the information up front. If it could be put in your terms and conditions, it could be put in your privacy policy that is shared that people have to check off. Whichever way it's being done, the point is that it needs to give users a chance to have informed consent. And if you don't have the information, let's say on a website or in T&C, and when you're talking with your MSMEs, you want to ask them, check with them, does your website or your landing page or whatever medium it is that you're using, does it actually have a section that speaks to why you're collecting this data, how the data is going to be used, how it is going to be stored? If they don't have that in their on their sites or where people are acknowledging it, then they need to be prepared to answer the question in case somebody asks, right? And especially now when you're finding that there are all these different laws and rules that are being introduced to ensure that organizations are being more responsible. That transparency piece is more and more critical. Now, having access to customer data also means that organizations have a requirement to protect this data. And so privacy information is really, really important, and is even critical when you think about how critical it is, especially with all these different rules and laws that are now coming into play. There is something to be said for data privacy, because persons' information can, if it's being shared too much, it can actually be something that can lead to their safety and security becoming at risk, right? So while we're going to talk a little bit more about privacy later on, it is something that you want to make sure that you are paying attention to. All right. Now, the next item after privacy is intention. What is the intention that you have behind collecting this data? It should be an informed intention, not where you're just kind of doing it because you know that you're supposed to, or maybe you can use it one day. It has to be an intentional mechanism that you are putting in place to actually collect the data, and organizations should ask themselves why they need the information, what is being gained from it, and if they intend, what is the intended use of the information, whether or not it is malicious. If it is not ethical to collect it, then they should not do so. Intention should be considered for every piece of information that is collected. Similarly, outcomes. Even when intentions are pure, the outcomes from collecting data could still be negative or harmful. While the impacts may not be known until after the data has been collected and analyzed, considering the potential outcome ahead of time could help to identify possible harmful impacts. So when you're thinking about sharing insights on ethical collection, then you definitely want to consider these 5 factors. And this research was actually done by Harvard. Of course, we always love our experts, right? So Catherine Coate, who actually writes for the Harvard Business School, talks about data ethics encompassing the moral obligation. Excuse me. She talked about that data ethics encompasses the moral obligation of gathering, protecting, and using personally identifying information and how it affects individuals. So just remember that part, right? That it's not just on a whim, because you need it, right? But it's really about the moral obligation of gathering, protecting, and using personally identifiable information and how it affects individuals. And we all, as stated earlier, have the right to make sure that our information is protected. And as organizations that are leading other companies, we need to ensure that they are putting into practice some of the principles and factors that they have to consider as they look to collect this data. Now, there are a number of ways that businesses can collect data, and there are 7 of them that Catherine Coate details in the Harvard Business School information that is shared. And these methods are probably most of them that you are familiar with. These are the 7, and there, as I said, there are some of these that you may already be familiar with, and then maybe there are a couple of them that you are not. Surveys or polls. So we've been collecting data this entire course, right? For this entire series, we've been collecting data through the use of polls, which is similar to a survey. And surveys are one of the most, what I would consider, straightforward, low-hanging ways for organizations to get feedback from their market or from their stakeholders. And one of the ways that, a simple quote unquote survey that can actually be utilized is the Net Promoter Score. And a lot of companies actually use Net Promoter Scoring to assess how they are actually addressing their customer needs. So it's literally sometimes just 1 or sometimes 2 questions, but never more than 3. And the idea is for it to be something that is quick and easy that persons can tap into. Online surveys offer organizations a way to easily and affordably reach large groups of people. Though affordable and effective in their reach, they come with, of course, their own risk of bias, because participants' answers can be swayed by the way the questions are framed, and also by the knowledge that their answers are being read by a particular organization. So when you're thinking about, advising your MSMEs on utilizing surveys, they want to make sure that the way that the questions are being framed are open and allow for persons to think through and give honest or authentic answers, right? Now, the next way of collecting data is what is called transactional tracking. And this is essentially probably straightforward and when I say straightforward, meaning this is essentially something that just kind of happens as you as a customer are participating or engaging with a company. So when you go online and you're purchasing, depending on where you click and depending on what credit cards you're using and the payment method that you're choosing to use, the different things you're selecting on the site, whether or not you're actually going through and answering feedback afterwards, whether you are actually completing your cart purchase or you're saving things in your cart. All of these things are a part or support transactional tracking. And this is a way that businesses can gather insights and get to know who is buying for them. Right now, in some instances, one of the things that you may experience as you are making some purchases is that it will ask you for demographic information, which is not something that is common to experience when you're just, going into a store and buying something. But when you're online, this is a captive space for a business to actually get more information about who you are and how you are actually purchasing, who you are and how you navigate purchasing from them. So that's a transactional way that persons can gather insights about you. There are also interviews and focus groups, which is another thing you're more familiar with, which is a more direct way. We talked about that with Rule 21. It could be through a telephone call, or it could be through an invite-only participation with a small group of people to answer several different types of questions. It could also be through observation. And observation is just looking at how users are interacting with a product or website, whether it's through a third-party tool or a beta version of a product. So for instance, let's say that something is getting ready to launch, it's not yet out, and you decide that you're going to utilize the opportunity to get feedback from the market by testing out something that you put up on the website and say, new product coming soon, and you want to see how many people click on it based on what you've actually put up on as a website banner, as an example. And the data collected from this method provides organizations with an opportunity to make improvements. So if, for instance, you're testing out whether or not people will be interested in a new product, and let's say you placed on the top of the site and, in a banner to say, hey, we're coming out with our new green eggs and ham product. If you're, let's say a restaurant that, has a site that utilizes scheduling or whatever, and you put this up and say, hey, we're putting out, green eggs and ham on our menu, and we would love to share the recipe with you so that you can make it at home on your own, and you see if people click on it or people don't click on it. You can gauge whether or not it's something that you want to add to the menu or not. All right. So that's observation. Then there is online tracking, and online tracking refers really to measuring the engagement that the company is experiencing using cookies. So you may be familiar with cookies because nowadays it's hard to go to any website without actually seeing them say to you, will you accept all cookies or will you manage your cookies? I prefer to actually manage my cookies. I'm one of those people that I will go in and I will actually choose to have only the required cookies turned on, and that I don't want to have the marketing related cookies turned on when I am visiting a site. So I will tend to do that. But a lot of persons, just like that form at the end of the landing page, they just check the box because they want to move on to whatever it is that they're doing, right? But it is very important for us to recognize that people are going to interact with different types of data collection methods in different ways. And so we want to ensure that we are not just looking at one type, like cookies or putting on pixels on different pages to track where people are going, but to also include different things that are going to give you more accurate and on-point data specifically related to someone's interaction, where you're asking them questions and they're actually inputting information. Forms, which you are probably accustomed to, are really useful when you are seeking to get that type of targeted information that I just mentioned. So forms are great when you are now looking to actually gather insights and continue to engage with customers. So if you are putting out something that is downloadable, that you want to attract for a particular audience, you want to start to build out your email list. And so you want to make sure that you begin collecting information from your ideal person, because you're going to be marketing something to them, whether it's a new product or an existing product, but you want to interact with them in a more intimate way. Then utilizing forms to actually gather that information is a really great way to do that. And forms that actually are sharing something with them to then collect their information is what is probably most common now in the space, in the digital space. And I'm sure that you guys have also probably experienced something like that, where if you are, it's asking you for information, it'll be because it's going to share some type of valuable insight or some kind of quick tips or something that the customer would find valuable. They're offering to you in exchange for your information, so that you as a company can use the data to contact people who may be interested in the product. This is also a great way to build out those demographic profiles for existing customers and utilize in the email workflows, and of course, in the type of content that you're going to be sharing with people. Last but certainly not least is social media monitoring. And this is one that I think is probably one of the lowest hanging fruit for companies that don't necessarily have websites, have not been able to make that investment yet, or are not confident enough in making that investment. It's still possible to collect information and to understand who your target customer is, who your dream customers are, and to get the type of information that will serve you in a cost-effective way. And social media monitoring has really advanced in the way that it's actually able to collect information and share it with you. So for example, if your MSMEs have a retail shop on Instagram, and they don't have their own website, it's still a great platform to use, because their data insights continue to get better and better. You can see demographic information, because when you're signing up for your Instagram account or your Facebook account, you typically have to enter demographic information, right? They can see location information. You can see how often they're engaging with your content. You can see what they're clicking on or what they're skipping past, right? And so social media monitoring has actually become one of the more common ways that businesses actually track their potential or ideal customers and get that information that they can utilize to tweak their strategies, right? So this, I think, is really insightful, guys. And I'm sure that many of you are utilizing in some way, shape, or form one or more of these collection methods. And so I want this to be our first opportunity for our engagement. We're going to collect some data using our favorite data collection mechanism in this course, which is our poll. So I have a poll up now, and it's asking what methods of data collection are used in your organization. And this can either be based on what you are using as a member of the organization or what you participate in. All right. So just asking just to take a couple of minutes to answer the poll that's on the screen. And let us know, what exactly is it that you are currently collecting? Great. I'm seeing a lot of okay, definitely surveys are being used. Okay. See that? Great. All right. Excellent. I have a lot of answers here. Great. Almost 100% participation. Wonderful. I have a leading area that a lot of people use. So I'm going to wrap up the poll now. I think what's really cool about this, guys, that you'll see is that every single method is being used in one way, shape, or form. So we have some that are more popular, like surveys and forms, which is expected. You can kind of gauge what you are familiar with based on what you're familiar with in the organization, based on what you probably use the most. And so definitely surveys and forms, because we're accustomed to filling those out. There's also interviews and focus groups and observation. And the not so popular is the transactional tracking and the online tracking. And I feel that some of this, in terms of the transactional tracking and the online tracking, sometimes is related to the familiarity with the different tools that can be used to support that, whether it is familiarity because you just don't know, or the organizations that you support just don't know, or the cost, because in many instances, cookies come at a cost. You have to pay for cookies in order to track persons. And when it comes to transactional tracking, you have to make sure that you actually have your e-commerce mechanism set up so that you are looking at transactions, right? So persons are still setting up their e-commerce platforms and portals. So I can anticipate that that may be a little bit on the lower scale, but this is actually a really good reflection of what's happening, I think, generally speaking, from both our experience as individuals and also from the side of the companies. What I would love to hear from you now is actually why you collect this data. So you can either drop it in the chat, or if you want, I'm happy to take your comments directly. But why is this data being collected within your organization? What is it used for? Anybody want to share? You can drop it in the chat, or you can hop on and share with us. And I'll give just a couple minutes for that. All right. So Andrea has said that they collect data to assess the usefulness of strategies. Thank you very much for that. And I think that's actually something that's kind of what Route 21 was doing. You know, they were shifting their part of their digital engagement strategy to be from buy online, pick up in store. And they were utilizing their data collection to actually validate how successful that is. Julia says feedback from clients regarding effectiveness of services. Absolutely. Definitely that client feedback is something that persons come back to and try to get insight on. Absolutely. So there you go, Julia. Thank you for sharing that. Catherine says to see what her clients want and what strategies are working best. Yes, absolutely. Marcia says to improve processes. Awesome. Measuring different aspects of training, content, facilities, delivery. Wow, you guys are okay. Yeah, you're killing it. You're using data for all the reasons that it actually is supporting your greatness. So I can totally appreciate that. All right, so now we're going to be moving on. And guys, thank you very much again for your participation. I can always depend on you to make sure that we are keeping our class time alive. So you are appreciated. All right, so we've talked about the different types of collection methods that are used in your own organization. And now we're going to talk about analytics and visualizations. Now, when you're thinking about data analytics, right, there are different types of analytics, okay? Descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive. And of course, there are different types of analytics that are used at different points in time, depending on not just what you need, but also depending on the maturity of the organization. So when we think about the 4 types that are shared here, let's just quickly examine what it means. So descriptive examines data to describe what has happened. So it's really a reflective kind of view. And diagnostic tries to get to the bottom of what has happened. So again, that kind of, okay, well, this is what's going on. What can I make from this? An assessing kind of view. Predictive uses that historical data to attempt to predict what will happen in the future. And prescriptive suggests next steps for persons who are in organizations in order to meet their goals. So descriptive and diagnostic are more reflective, assessing type of things. And then predictive and prescriptive are really more futuristic, looking towards the future. Not saying that you wouldn't be using descriptive and diagnostic in that way, but it's just the way that the data is actually leveraged is different based on the 4 different types of analytics. Now, in an explainer for financial news outlet Investopedia, and if you guys don't use Investopedia, but you are interested in investing, I highly, highly recommend it because it's literally like Wikipedia, but specifically focused on money and assets and investing, right? So if you are into that kind of thing, then Investopedia is definitely a great source for you to do that. And what they've done with Investopedia is that they actually went through some analysis techniques. So once you've actually considered the types of analytics, right, the 4 types, then now it's, okay, well, let's look at the different techniques that we're going to be utilizing as we go through and do this type of analysis. So you have regression analysis, which involves examining dependent variables to ascertain if a change in one will impact another. Factor analysis, which involves separating a large data set into smaller data sets so that you can discover insights that you may not find when you're looking at this large amount of information. Cohort analysis involves mining a data set for related groups and then dividing that data into cohorts that possess similar characteristics. Monte Carlo involves modeling the likelihood of particular outcomes. So what one you may see in one simulation, what is the likelihood of that particular simulation happening in other types of situations? And then time series analysis involves tracking data over time. So you have different types of analysis that you can apply, and you also have different types of analytics. So imagine looking at your different types of analytics through the lens of the different types of analysis. What basically this is saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the power of data science is so deep and it is so informative and can be so beneficial for businesses that it can really impact significantly the success that a business has in employing and deploying different types of strategies. And when you are actually looking at this insight that is being provided, that information is coming to you through visualization. And data visualization involves taking the numbers and using them to create a graphic that is easier to understand. And that way you can draw meaning from that information. And sometimes it's not necessarily just numbers, right? Because you also have location data, demographic data. And yes, this data is typically reflected through numbers that is then analyzed and given in word form. But there's so many different methods that you can utilize to look at it. So you have pie charts, bar graphs, histograms, heat maps, etc. And there are different types of tools that can be used to actually identify or to do this data visualization. You may be familiar with the more common tools that are out there, like Power BI, which is a Microsoft-based tool, is very common and is also widely used and is known for its simplicity. And you also have visualization tools like Tableau, which is somewhat common, but maybe a little bit less simple to use than Power BI. Now, the key to all of this, guys, if you recall, when we started this conversation, is that you can collect the data, but if you're not actually utilizing it, or in this case, analyzing it, then you're not really able to actually take the data and move it towards action, which ultimately That's the reason you're collecting it in the first place, right? So one key part of gaining insights from collecting this data is making sure that that intention that you had at the outset is top of mind. So when we were looking at all the different reasons why people collect data and the different factors that need to be considered when you're going into data collection, that was, this is the stuff that was written by Catherine Coates from Harvard. The main thing, the 5 main things there was the intention. And that's where your questions are going to come from. So if you're going into the process of utilizing data science to support, the greatness of the organization, and this is something that MSMEs need to keep in mind, they have to understand the why behind the data collection. What are the questions that they are trying to answer from this information so that they know what to ask and they're getting the answers that they can later on analyze. After organizing and creating visualization of that data, businesses can then start to interpret the information, draw their own conclusions, and make predictions in order to answer the initial problem or question that they were going after in the first place. Now, when you have data analysts as a part of a team, even if you have one person that is a part of the team that is assigned to looking at data, which is something that you can actually recommend for your MSMEs. If they're very small and they're starting out with a small team, it can be a dual role where somebody that maybe is in touch with the market, that they're actually looking at the insights that's coming back in, or it could be the owner of the business that wants to stay on the pulse. So this is something that they hold on to, that data insight, right? So they can ask what they can learn from the results and how it either reinforces or negates some of the assumptions or some of the ideas that they may have had ahead of time or before they actually started to do this analysis. And every analysis should be a feedback loop that deepens the learning. And we talk about that iterative loop. Actually, we mentioned it, I think, from the very first session we had in this series, is that the way that digital transformation has really shifted our thinking and our ways of working is that it's not a one and done kind of thing, right? It's a test, measure, learn, and then you're repeating that cycle. Right? You're testing it, you're measuring it, and you're learning from it, and you're repeating that cycle, right? And it's the same thing with data. When you're thinking about data analysis, you definitely want to be thinking about, how are you learning from that? All right, so Julia has positioned a question in the chat. What are your views of the scenario where sometimes the research or collection question may not be accurate or appropriate, but the data collected could discover or provide other insights not previously thought about or recognized? Well, I think as long as, Julia, my perspective is as long as that information is being collected ethically, then it's great, actually, because sometimes you're not necessarily clear on the question that you're going to be asking, and that's a fact. Right? And so we don't want to negate the value of starting with a question, because the idea is to step out in curiosity so that you can begin the process. And as you start to harvest data, then you're clearly going to get more clarity and more information that can then be utilized towards whatever that outcome is. So actually, it's a great point that you've raised, Julia, where in some instances, you're not necessarily going to start off with the right question, but it gives you some information that allows you, again, to do that learning, right? And going back out there and getting more insight and information, which is why it is typically an iterative and agile process. Yes, so professionals are going to put a lot of emphasis on the research question. And sometimes, especially if it is market research, for example, one of the clients that I'm working with right now is entering into that kind of phase for their digital transformation. They have new products that they're going to be deploying, and they want to really shift consumer behavior. And so because they have that intention in mind, we want to shift consumer behavior towards being more digital. The market research firm that they're working with is taking that into consideration. And so there is emphasis placed. However, it can't be the is all and end all. And good research companies or good research professionals know that there is always something new to discover. And so while, yes, they may put emphasis on that starting point, there can always be things that are discovered in the process that are going to support or shift the way that they were thinking about things. All right, so I'm just going to pull up the Point Defiance Zoo, which you guys will have in your you will actually have it in your manual. Did I forget to drop the manual in the chat this morning? I just jumped right into the lesson. I mean, hello. I think I need to make sure that I have dropped the manual in. So let me do that actually now. And at the same time, I'll make sure that we have a quick discussion about our, oh, I want to share this before I do that. I want to make sure that we have a quick discussion about our case study that this small business learned from big data. So all right. And I'm going to share my screen. I paused because when I went to look at the case study, this is great. I just love when life does its thing, right? So you'll notice on my screen, we use cookies on our website to support technical features that enhance your user experience and help us improve our website. By continuing to use this website, you accept. So this isn't even one where you're checking the box, you know, folks. This is one where it's saying to you, hey there, by continuing, you are accepting our privacy policy and terms of use. So these are the documents that I was talking to you all about when we were starting the conversation, to say, hey, you want to make sure that, you know, your MSMEs actually have these terms of use and the policies, etc., that are a part of today's requirement for privacy, right? Observing those GDPR rules and regulations. And hey, look at this. Inc. this morning, sign up for daily newsletter and be the first to access our upcoming Inc. regionals coverage. Oh my gosh, this is like Inc. is trying to teach this session for me. This is great, right? So again, now we're actually seeing different ways that they are collecting data, and they are encouraging you. So they have the privacy policy here again, right, that you can go to. And they're giving you a fear of missing out. They're giving you a little marketing tease here where it says, be the first to access. And who doesn't want to be the first? So of course, you're going to want to drop your email in here, because they've promised you two things. They promised you the newsletter, and they've promised you that you're going to be the first, right? So you're now going to submit your information and you're going to sign up. So this is a great example, guys, of how data is so critical in the way that we use it today, right? So thanks to data crunching, more people see Blizzard, the polar bear, at the Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium in Tacoma, Washington, right? And the way, guys, that this particular case study is supporting you is that it's a zoo. And who would be thinking, right, that a zoo is actually going to have them, a zoo is actually going to have a situation where you can actually now be utilizing that information. But everybody's utilizing data now, right? And so the primary things that we wanted to learn from the case study was that in utilizing the different pieces of information that they were able to gather, they were able to compare historical attendance against weather in order to predict future attendance, and then make sure that they were scheduling appropriately. I don't know if you've been to the zoo in North America, to any large zoo in North America. The last one that I went to with my kids was the San Diego Zoo, which is a really great one. It has the whales and all these really cool things. And they're very intentional about the schedule of activities and how they guide you through the different parts of the zoo, right? And at different points, they have interaction where you can just very simply touch screen and say whether you're happy, sad, using the emoji, happy faces. And so that's actually how they're collecting the information, right? And when you're purchasing your ticket, you're purchasing your ticket using a credit card, and that credit card will have information about where you're located. And so what it does now is it's actually assessing the zip codes that are coming often based on your transactional information, right? And so these different methods that we are seeing and engaging with are really great ways of showing us how organizations are utilizing data collection ethically, of course, data collection and tracking mechanisms to then analyze information and make the experience that you have, and not just you, but your family, etc. Make sure that the experience that you have is optimized and that you keep coming back for more. So that's another key thing, a key factor, guys, that data is actually a really great way to engage and ensure retention. So that part after people have converted and you're now trying to emphasize loyalty and the retention of customers, that's a really great way for data to be leveraged, because it allows you to actually utilize information that you get from customers to be better, to do better at serving them. Okay. Now, let's move on to privacy, which has become more and more important in our day-to-day and how our day-to-day actually is being impacted by these new ways of digital transformation, how not just our businesses, but again, our personal lives. Yes, so Julia, I'm not yet sharing. I'm going to go back to, I was just having the conversation about the business case, and I'm going to go back in now and actually share on data privacy. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for that note. Okay. All right, so here we go. Data privacy. So when we talk about data privacy and we think about what is data privacy, right? So data privacy is about managing who has authorized access. And I think that part of the message is probably what is most important. Who has authorized access? There we go. Gosh. Who has authorized access to the information an organization holds, right? And when you think about that information, we talked about it earlier, it's personal information that is not owned by the company, that is owned by the individual. So some of the key things that you want to consider when you're thinking about privacy is to understand what is meant by personal information. So that's your name, email addresses, phone number, any kind of financial data, so banking, credit card, debit card, any kind of purchase information, identification numbers, so things like your passport number or your national ID number, race, ethnicity, your demographic, deep demographic, personal information about yourself, race, ethnic origin, age, height, blood type, anything that has to do with that. All of these things are considered personal information. And this is where all these laws around privacy have come about. Now, when we talk about legislation and the different ways that customers' information can actually be misused, or as was mentioned earlier in the chat by one of our participants, security, cybersecurity, when the war of the future is not going to be about guns and, any, bombs. maybe although the atomic and the nuclear ones are still out there, but the wars of the future, which is really the present because you're actually seeing it already, is really going to be around data. And that's why data protection is so critical. So when we think about data protection in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, and the Cayman Islands have laws that are very aligned with, or if you can say synonymous with, the GDPR regulations that you would have seen coming out a couple of years ago. When GDPR was being launched, there was a lot of I won't call it fanfare because it's actually necessary policies and procedures that were being put out. But there was a lot of fear around GDPR and what it would mean. There was a lot of misconception about whether or not the GDPR laws would impact countries that were not a part of the European Union, right? And there was a lot of misunderstanding and misconception around it. And a large part of why there was fear is because of the fines and legislative aspects to what companies could face if they were not being compliant, right? And so GDPR really started that process of setting a high standard for protection and consideration for the privacy of human data and how that aligns with our human rights. Now, even though the GDPR is a regulation for the EU, its scope does include business processes that personal data of citizens of the European Union, even when they're not physically in the EU. And so that's what companies had to be doing. They had to look at, well, how many customers do I actually have in Europe? And am I storing that information? Am I attracting persons from there? Am I meeting the necessary regulations that are required for doing business with persons that are in that space? When we think about data protection in the Caribbean and what's really important for our MSMEs to understand, whether or not the policies and procedures are actually active in your country, is you want to make sure that data is processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently. We talked a bit about transparency a little bit earlier in our session today. We want to make sure that that the data that is being collected is adequate, yet limited to what is necessary. So you want to try to balance the adequacy as against what is actually relevant to the goals or the intention that you have for data that's being collected. You want to make sure that the data is accurate and up to date. You also want to make sure that it is kept in a form that the data subject or the individual can be identified only as long as it is necessary for processing, so that it's not being used in a biased way, which is another thing that has to be protected. Not looking to see whether it's a male or a female so that you can then determine whether or not they get, access to certain things or a certain type of, whether or not they are located in a particular part of the country so that they can't be discriminated against for that. You also want to make sure it's processed in a manner that ensures security. So while you have scrutiny, you also want to have security, and can only be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. As companies are thinking about in the individuals that they're collecting this data for, right? Some of the things that they need to consider is that the individuals have the right to be informed, they have the right of access, they need to be honest, that transparency piece, right to rectification. So if the information that is collected is not correct, they have the right to make sure that that information is collected, is accurate, and that it is updated to reflect that. The right to erasure, that their information can be removed, to restrict processing for the data to be ported or not ported, and the right to object to anything that the organization deems is necessary for the use of their data. When companies are thinking about establishing data privacy policies, and this again is whether or not the government of the country has actually put policies in place, they want to consider a data security policy that outlines overall security management for the organization. And this sometimes they may need assistance to do, or if they can't, if they're intending to take it on themselves, then similar to how they would have somebody that's looking at data and analyzing it, you know, like a data analyst, they also want to consider having a data officer that is looking at the efficacy of how that data is being managed, right? And what exactly is it that their organization is doing to ensure that there is good data security, that there's a policy that's in place to help protect the personal information that the organization is keeping for its customers. And not only that there's a policy in place, but that there is actually tangible things being done to prevent a breach of that data, because that's ultimately what is going to happen, is that if the policy is in place, but there aren't tangible things that are in-house to actually protect data, whether it is that information is, if the information is stored internally on a server, then they need to make sure that they have the accurate security measures in place. If it's stored in the cloud, they need to make sure that they are paid up on the different protection mechanisms that AWS offers or Azure offers, right? They want to make sure that there is proper data security practices on an organizational level. And that can be done through different types of cybersecurity tests, right? So it kind of works hand in hand, okay? And that it's covering every single level of the organization, both at a strategic level and at an operational day-to-day level. Some key considerations for organizations to take in when they are looking at data privacy policies: who has responsibility for the data security in the organization? Now, who is that person that is the owner, that is accountable? Because at any given point in time, if there are any data challenges or if there's a breach, or if someone wants to understand what the policies are, then there needs to be an identified and accountable person that can be that point person that persons can go to. They want to make sure that there are guidelines documented on staff usage of computers or information storage tools, including the use of computers, especially now that we are in this hybrid world where not everybody is coming into office and sitting at a desktop. Many persons are utilizing laptops, and sometimes it's company laptops. And if persons are utilizing company laptops in coffee shops that don't have secure networks, then they could potentially put the company's customer information at risk, right? So consideration has to be given for things like usage restrictions and also what consequences are going to be employed when there is non-compliance. Another critical thing for organizations should consider when they're looking at their privacy policies is storage. Sometimes there isn't an intentional way of actually storing data, and how often backups are done of that information. And this is really critical when you're looking at accountability and making promises to customers about their information. And last but not least, the security measures that are in place, which we kind of talked about before. You want to make sure that they include some basic things like encryption, firewalls, antivirus software, and very secure servers. So when you're thinking through supporting MSMEs and advising them on just some basic things, right? Once you start to collect customer information and store that information, then just have a personal data protection and privacy policy, right? So make sure to have that policy available. They have multiple templates now available online because there are so many different laws that are in place. And this particular policy is essentially one that is kind of like a blanket approach. It covers how the data is collected, how it's handled, how it's stored. So all of these items that we just touched on, this particular protection policy, this data protection policy, should be enough to cover all of these items. And even without the government issuing its own privacy laws, can take into consideration laws that are out there. The successful implementation of a personal data protection policy goes a long way towards advancing good privacy practices in an organization. And it's also something that can be leveraged with employees that may not be technically savvy, but can understand wanting their own information protected, and therefore making sure that protection is in place for their customers and that this policy document actually shows that protection. It should also include an overview, a defined purpose, a summary of applicable privacy laws, and a specific scope in relation to the organization themselves, right? And of course, it would incorporate some staff guidelines that we talked about earlier, that we would want to make sure that these things are observed. We also talked a little bit about the storage expectations that we want to make sure are covered in that policy. Everybody in an organization has responsibilities for data privacy. And while our leadership, CEOs, the IT manager, privacy officer, company secretaries, right? Anybody that has that kind of legal touch point or accountability, they may have more specific responsibilities. Every single person has their own individual responsibility to make sure that personal data that is being worked with is handled in a way that meets moral obligations of the organization. And when there are specific responsibilities within a role, then the privacy policy should reflect the specific responsibilities separate and apart from the general responsibilities that all employees have. So there is a case study that is included with your manuals. And when you look at this case study, you'll get a sense of how legislation in different countries matches up with the EU laws. And so you can do that as your fun work coming out of today's session. And hopefully it will help to underscore some of the things that we covered in our conversation today. So as we wrap up, guys, I'll just ask if there are any questions that you may have for me before we close out. The page was not found, Catherine, that's for the last case study. Is that the last case study that's in the manual about the Caribbean data protection laws? Yes? Okay, no problem. I will look back at the link and have that resent to you. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I appreciate it. Okay, Ayola, thank you so much. Very informative. Thanks for steady submissions of the manual. No problem. My absolute pleasure. Put the number before the title. It's supposed to say course 5 or course 6 in the name for the manual. I think this one has course 6. The others had 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It says in the email subject. Okay. I thought I was doing that. I'll double check again and see, because usually I put course 6, etc. Popular collection tools MSMEs can use for social media. All right. I'll see what I can do for you there, Julia. So Julia has sent a separate question for a list of popular data collection tools MSMEs can use for social. I mean, there's one that I can just share right off the bat right now, which is SurveyMonkey, right? So I use SurveyMonkey actually quite a bit. I would consider that one of the more popular ones. A free tool that can be used is Google, right? Google is another free one that can be used. You can literally set up a Google form like that and get instant insights on what is happening with your customers. Andrea is suggesting Question Pro, right? That can be utilized. I also use Typeform as another one that you can leverage. And Typeform offers both free and paid versions for data collection, right? So that's 3 that you got, or 4 that you got. So there's SurveyMonkey, there's Google Forms, there's Question Pro from Andrea, and then there's also Typeform, all right? And they can connect all of these on social media just through a direct link to the form. Very straightforward and very simple, okay? Awesome. All right, thanks very much, guys. I have my next step for you, and we'll look out. So we'll look out for any other questions that you may have. You can feel free to email me. So thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful weekend. Next week, we have our final session in the series. Can you believe we're here already, guys? Final session. You're going to miss me. I hope I'll miss you guys too. So next week, we'll have our final session, which will be on processes that are useful for digital transformation. So I look forward to seeing you for our final session next week. And I'll send that manual ahead so that you can get a jump on your reading. Thanks and have a great weekend. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Julia. Thank you. Take care.